My beloved, pause here for a moment, because what you are about to hear was never meant to arrive in an ordinary way. You could have kept scrolling. You could have passed by without noticing. Yet something inside you hesitated, something quiet pulled at your attention, and in this fictional message of divine reflection, there is a story waiting to unfold that reaches far deeper than a forgotten piece of paper. Somewhere in the silence between what was spoken and what was never said, a hidden love letter has been discovered. And the most surprising part is not simply that it exists. It is what was written when your soulmate believed you would never read it. There are feelings people confess when they know they will be heard, and then there are feelings they only dare to write when they believe the page will keep their secret forever. That difference matters. Words spoken aloud can be interrupted by fear, pride, timing, or the expression on another person's face. But words written alone in the middle of a quiet night can become a doorway into everything the heart was too frightened to reveal. And this letter, my child, carries the weight of such a doorway. It was not written casually. It was not a passing thought. Every line came from a place inside your soulmate that they had been protecting for longer than anyone around them realized. Stay with this message, because the first revelation is not the deepest one. At first glance, the letter seems like a confession of love. But hidden between its lines is something much larger, an explanation. An explanation for distance. An explanation for silence. An explanation for moments that may once have looked like indifference but were actually shaped by an inner battle you were never allowed to see. Your soulmate had moments when they wanted to reach toward you, moments when your name sat at the edge of their lips, moments when they imagined saying everything plainly. Yet something repeatedly pulled them backward. The letter begins gently. Not dramatically. Not with a shocking declaration. It begins almost like an apology to someone who is not there. Your soulmate writes about remembering small things. The way a conversation with you stayed in their mind longer than expected. The way an ordinary moment somehow became important only because you were part of it. They describe trying to move on with daily life, only to discover that something about you kept returning in unexpected places. A song. A familiar phrase. A quiet evening. A place they passed without thinking. Nothing supernatural had to happen. The heart itself had become the reminder. And then the writing changes. The sentences become heavier, as though they had stopped trying to sound composed. Your soulmate admits that there was a moment when they almost told you the truth. Not the polished truth. Not the safe version. The whole truth. They had imagined how the conversation might begin. They had rehearsed certain words privately. They had even thought about what they would say if you asked them why they waited so long. But when the moment came, courage disappeared beneath uncertainty. This is where the letter becomes more personal. They write that they were afraid you had already decided who they were. Afraid that perhaps you had interpreted their silence as rejection. Afraid that opening their heart after so much hesitation would only make them look foolish. There is one line, simple in meaning but enormous in emotion, where they admit that losing the possibility of you felt terrifying, yet revealing their feelings and being turned away felt even more terrifying at the time. So they chose the one place between both risks. They stayed silent. But silence did not protect them. That is what your soulmate finally understood. Silence only created questions. And those questions grew. They began wondering whether you ever thought about them. Whether you had felt the same unusual pull. Whether you noticed the moments when they stayed a little longer than necessary, listened a little more carefully than they did with others, or became unexpectedly quiet whenever the conversation moved too close to matters of the heart. They wondered whether you ever saw the things they believed they were hiding so well. And my child, this is where another part of the letter becomes impossible to ignore. Your soulmate writes about jealousy, but not in the way you may expect. It is not possessive. It is not angry. It is the quiet ache of imagining that someone else might one day receive the honesty they failed to give you. They pictured another person discovering your kindness, your patience, the way you notice details, the way you carry certain emotions without announcing them. And suddenly your soulmate realized that waiting forever was not neutral. Waiting was a decision too. They wrote, in their own way, that every day they remained silent created more room for life to move without them. That realization frightened them. For a while, they tried to reason with themselves. They told themselves that perhaps the connection meant more in memory than it had in reality. They tried to reduce everything to coincidence. They convinced themselves that time would settle what emotions had complicated. But instead of disappearing, the feeling became quieter and deeper. Less dramatic, perhaps, but more undeniable. This letter was written during that stage. Not at the beginning of their feelings. After they had already tried to bury them. That is why it carries such weight. Your soulmate was not writing because they had suddenly become fascinated with you. They were writing because they had already spent too long trying not to be. And there is more. The letter reveals that someone around them once noticed the change. Maybe it was a close friend. Maybe a relative. Maybe someone who simply knew them well enough to notice when their attention wandered. This person asked a question about you, almost casually, but your soulmate's reaction betrayed more than they wanted. They avoided the subject. They changed the conversation. Yet afterward, they could not stop thinking about what had happened. Because sometimes, my child, we discover the truth about our own heart when someone else notices it before we are ready to admit it. That question followed them home. Later that night, they opened a notebook, a note on their phone, or perhaps an empty sheet of paper. They were not initially planning to write you a love letter. They simply wanted somewhere to put the thoughts that had become too loud to carry. But one sentence became another. One memory became another. Before long, they were no longer writing about you. They were writing to you. And that distinction changed everything. They addressed you as though you were sitting across from them. They imagined your eyes moving over every word. They imagined your reaction. They wondered where you would pause. Which sentence might surprise you? Which confession might make you look away for a second because it revealed something you had once suspected but never knew? Then came the part they nearly erased. Your soulmate admitted that there had been a period when they intentionally pulled away. Not because they stopped caring. Because caring had begun to feel too real. They feared becoming emotionally dependent on a future they could not control. They feared needing an answer from you that you might not be prepared to give. So they created distance, hoping distance would restore balance. But instead, distance taught them the value of your presence. They wrote about noticing the absence of things they had once taken for granted. A message. A conversation. Your name appearing unexpectedly. The possibility of seeing you. Even small interactions had once quietly brightened parts of their day, and only after creating space did they understand how much those moments had mattered. That is the cruelty of certain realizations. We often understand the importance of something most clearly when we try to live without it. Yet the letter does not blame you. That may be the most beautiful part. Your soulmate does not accuse you of failing to understand. They do not say you should have known. They admit that they gave you very little to work with. They understand that no one can be expected to read a heart that refuses to speak. And then comes one of the deepest confessions. They write that if you ever believed you were difficult to love, they wished they had been brave enough to show you otherwise. Think about that. Not because this fictional message is claiming to reveal a literal fact about your life, but because the emotional truth inside that sentence touches something many hearts carry. How often do people walk away from relationships or possibilities believing they were unwanted, when the real story was that someone else simply lacked the courage, timing, maturity, or clarity to express what they felt? Your soulmate's letter carries that regret. Not regret for loving you. Regret for hiding it badly enough that you may have mistaken silence for emptiness. The pages continue. They mention a memory that still unsettles them. A moment when you looked at them as though you were waiting for something. Perhaps an answer. Perhaps honesty. Perhaps simply a sign. Your soulmate remembers that moment vividly because they now believe they could have changed everything by speaking. But they did not. They let the moment pass. And afterward, they replayed it. Again. And again. Not obsessively, but with the strange clarity hindsight gives us. They imagined different versions. In one, they admitted how they felt. In another, they asked whether you felt something too. In another, they simply asked you to stay a little longer. But reality remained unchanged. They had said nothing. That is why the letter exists. It became the conversation they never allowed themselves to have. And my child, something unexpected happens halfway through the letter. The tone shifts from confession to decision. Your soulmate stops writing only about the past. They begin writing about what they want. They describe a future with startling simplicity. Not extravagant promises. Not fantasy. Ordinary things. Conversations after difficult days. Laughing about something no one else would understand. Sitting beside you in comfortable silence. Supporting your dreams even when the road becomes uncertain. Learning the parts of you that cannot be understood quickly. Becoming someone you would never have to question. This is where the letter becomes more powerful than a simple declaration of love. Because attraction speaks about desire. Mature love speaks about presence. Your soulmate seems to understand this by the time they reach these pages. They no longer describe only what you make them feel. They describe the kind of person they would want to become beside you. And then they write something that changes the entire meaning of the letter. They say they do not know whether they will ever give it to you. Imagine that. All of these words. All of this vulnerability. And at the time of writing, they still believed you might never see a single sentence. Why? Because the letter was not originally created to convince you. It was created because they could no longer lie to themselves. That is the hidden truth. The first person your soulmate needed to confess their love to was not you. It was themselves. For a long time, they had disguised the connection beneath excuses. Timing. Circumstances. Uncertainty. Pride. Responsibilities. Emotional caution. Perhaps even fear of repeating something painful from the past. But as the letter continued, those excuses lost their power. The truth remained. You mattered. More than they had admitted. More than they intended. Maybe even more than they understood. And then there is a sentence that appears almost disconnected from everything around it. A single thought written after a long pause. The handwriting may have changed. The spacing may have widened. It feels as though your soulmate stopped, stared at the page, and decided whether to continue. They wrote about the possibility of losing you permanently. Not temporarily. Not simply going through a quiet season. Permanently. That thought seems to have shaken them. They imagined you building a life without them. They imagined hearing someday that you had found peace, love, companionship, and a future with someone else. And here is what surprised them most. Part of them believed they would genuinely want you to be happy, even if that happiness did not include them. But another part knew that it would hurt. Not because you owed them anything. Because they would always wonder what might have happened if they had spoken when they had the chance. This is where regret entered the letter. Before this, the pages are filled with fear and tenderness. Now regret begins to appear. Your soulmate realizes they had been waiting for certainty in a situation where certainty could only arrive after courage. They had wanted proof before taking the risk. But love rarely works that way. Sometimes the answer comes only after the question is finally asked. And in this fictional spiritual story, heaven seems to be using that lesson to speak beyond your soulmate's letter. Perhaps there are places in your own life where you have been waiting for perfect certainty before allowing yourself to move. Perhaps you have been asking for a sign strong enough to remove every possible fear. But courage is not the absence of uncertainty. Courage is deciding what kind of person you will be even while uncertainty remains. Your soulmate slowly learned this. The letter proves it. By the final pages, they begin addressing you with less fear. The sentences become clearer. They stop apologizing for every emotion. They stop hiding behind vague words. Something in them has changed through the act of writing. It is almost as though each paragraph removes another layer of armor. And then they finally write the words they had spent the entire letter avoiding. They love you. Not because you are perfect. Not because they have turned you into a fantasy. They love the version of you they have actually encountered. The strengths and hesitations. The warmth and distance. The moments of confidence and the moments when you seemed uncertain of yourself. They write that your imperfections somehow made the feeling more real, because love built only on an ideal image would collapse the moment reality appeared. But their feeling survived reality. That is what frightened them. They saw your humanity and still cared. Perhaps more deeply because of it. Then comes a surprising confession. They admit there were moments when they wanted to tell you, but something about your own energy seemed guarded. They wondered whether you had also been hurt before. Whether you had built quiet walls they did not know how to approach. They feared that arriving too strongly would make you retreat. So instead of speaking clearly, they waited for signs from you. And perhaps, without realizing it, you were waiting for signs from them. Two people standing on opposite sides of uncertainty, both hoping the other would cross first. That possibility haunts the letter. Your soulmate writes that perhaps the tragedy was never a lack of feeling. Perhaps it was two people protecting themselves at the same time. And this, my child, is where the story becomes even more mysterious. Because the letter was hidden. It was not destroyed. There is a difference. If your soulmate truly wanted these feelings erased forever, they could have deleted the words, torn the pages, or thrown the letter away. But they did not. They kept it. Somewhere private. Somewhere it remained untouched. For days. Maybe months. Maybe much longer. Why keep a letter you never intend to send? Perhaps because a small part of them hoped circumstances might someday change. Perhaps because the letter became evidence of a truth they did not want to forget. Perhaps because destroying it would feel like destroying the only place where they had ever been completely honest about you. Whatever the reason, it survived. And now, within this story, it has been found. That discovery changes everything. Because the person who found it was not supposed to. They were searching for something else. Something ordinary. Something unrelated to you. Yet the folded pages, saved note, or forgotten envelope appeared unexpectedly. At first, they may not even have understood its importance. Then they saw your name. And they stopped. This person had heard about you before. That is the next revelation. Your soulmate had not spoken openly about everything, but your name was not completely unknown. It had appeared in conversation once or twice. Maybe with unusual hesitation. Maybe with a smile that disappeared too quickly. Maybe with the kind of careful tone people use when a subject carries more emotion than they want to reveal. The person who discovered the letter remembered those moments. And suddenly, pieces began connecting. They realized why certain questions had made your soulmate uncomfortable. They realized why your name had carried weight. They realized there had been an entire hidden emotional world happening beneath the surface. But they did not immediately confront your soulmate. Something stopped them. Perhaps respect. Perhaps shock. Perhaps the realization that they were holding something extremely private. So the letter remained secret for a little longer. Yet secrets rarely remain unchanged once another person knows. The energy around your soulmate subtly shifted. The person who found the letter began observing them differently. Ordinary comments about love, relationships, timing, or missed opportunities suddenly carried new meaning. And your soulmate noticed. They sensed something was different. They began wondering whether someone had discovered what they tried so carefully to hide. That is when the tension began. Your soulmate returned to the place where they had kept the letter. And it was not exactly where they remembered leaving it. For one long moment, everything inside them went still. The possibility entered their mind immediately. Someone had seen it. Someone knew. And suddenly, the confession they had been afraid to show you was no longer completely under their control. They could continue hiding. They could pretend nothing happened. Or they could finally face the truth the letter had been forcing them toward from the beginning. And my child, this is where something remarkable occurs. Instead of feeling only panic, your soulmate also feels relief. Because sometimes the secret that terrifies us most becomes exhausting to protect. Part of them was frightened someone might tell you. But another part quietly wondered what would happen if you finally knew. Would you be shocked? Would you understand old moments differently? Would you realize that silence never meant absence? Would you be angry they waited? Would you laugh gently and say you had suspected it all along? Would you walk away? Or would something long unfinished finally begin? These questions became impossible to escape. And then your soulmate discovered something else. The person who found the letter had left something behind. Not a confrontation. Not an accusation. A small note. Just a few words. Words that caused your soulmate's heart to pound harder than anything written in the love letter itself. The note said, in essence, that some truths become heavier the longer they are hidden. Your soulmate read it more than once. They knew exactly what it meant. Someone had read the letter. Someone knew about you. And whoever it was believed silence had lasted long enough. That night, your soulmate could not rest easily. They walked through memories they had tried to keep organized for far too long. Every missed opportunity. Every unfinished conversation. Every time your name appeared in their thoughts at an inconvenient moment. Every occasion when they almost reached out but stopped themselves. The letter had transformed from a private confession into a challenge. Would they continue protecting fear? Or would they finally protect what they felt? And this is the moment when the story takes a turn even your soulmate did not expect. Because they opened the letter again. They began reading it from the beginning. But this time, they were not the same person who had written it. They had changed. Life had changed. You may have changed. And as they reached the final page, they suddenly realized there was one confession missing. The most important one. A truth they had not been ready to admit even to themselves when the letter was first written. They picked up a pen. Or opened the note again. And beneath the final sentence, they added a new paragraph. This new paragraph was shorter than everything before it. But its meaning was greater. Because it was not about the past. It was about what they intended to do next. Your soulmate wrote that if they ever had one real opportunity to tell you the truth, they would not run from it again. Then they added something else. Something that made even the person who later saw those words understand that the story was no longer simply about hidden love. Your soulmate had made a decision. A decision connected to you. A decision they had been quietly preparing to act on. And just before the letter closes, there is one final unfinished sentence. A sentence that begins with the words they were finally ready to tell you. But the rest of that sentence is the part that changes everything.